let's just jump right in then. So I want to start in the middle. And when I say the middle, I mean the middle of the Civil War, 1863, summer of 1863. Now at this point, 2 years into the war, people in the North have experienced a lot of ups and downs, some victories, a lot of defeats, but by the summer of 1863, it looks like things are finally going in the right direction. There's a huge victory in southeastern Pennsylvania at Gettysburg, of course. Another huge victory on the Mississippi River at Vicksburg. And then in the middle of the country at the time, Union General William S. Rosecrans had led his Union Army through most of what was left of Confederate-held Tennessee. So everywhere, the Union Army is winning, except on the borderlands of Missouri and Kansas. There, the Union Army was decidedly out of control. They did not have a handle on what was happening there. And this all culminated in August 21st, 1863, when somewhere between 250 and 400 guerrillas, Confederate guerrillas, rode out of Missouri into Kansas, and in the early morning hours, dashed into Lawrence, Kansas. They caught the people of Kansas unawares, most of them asleep. They killed something like 180 men and boys. Most of them were unarmed. The specifics of what they did was even more horrific. You can see this was an illustration from Harper's Weekly that came out a few weeks after the attack, and it's surprisingly accurate. But you can see men being killed right in front of their families, terrible things happening. And once these people were killed, they burnt the town to the ground. Now, in the wake of this attack, everyone across the country wanted to know who were these guys? Who were these men that had ridden into Lawrence, the symbol of abolitionism, killed all these people, burned it to the ground? And they especially wanted to know who was the man who had led them. Now, it would take about 50 years for the facts of William Clarke Quantrill's life to become broadcast. Now, some people must have known who he was in Kansas and Ohio, where he was born, and Missouri, and even here in Kentucky. But it wasn't until 1909 when that guy, William E. Connolly, who wrote the first really impressive biography of Quantrill, published his findings. And what he found shocked people. William Clarke Quantrill was not a Southerner. He didn't own slaves. He was born in Ohio. He had worked as a school teacher. He had lived in Kansas among the same people him and his guerrillas would later attack. Of course, I should mention too, he had free soil politics for a few years in Kansas. And then, of course, he joined the slaveholding Missourians when the war broke out, and then would become the architect of the raid on Lawrence. Now, since Connolly has published his book 113 years ago, every biographer of Quantrill more or less agrees with these facts, this outline here. But few have really tried to grapple with the complex human nuances that led this man through so many changes. So we have William E. Connolly. His version of Quantrill is what I would call the bad guy version, right? Quantrill was born evil. And so everything he did would lead him to, these sort of evil things that he did during the war. There's some other biographers who paint him as nothing but a sort of chivalrous and glorious, and they make excuses along the way. And in between those two archetypes is that sort of human complexity that I think is worth investigating. When I started looking into Quantrill, I was really interested in why he changed his politics, why he went from a free soiler to pro-slavery. I was interested when everybody else is deciding to put on uniforms and line up and kill each other from 50 yards away, why this guy decided to fight as a guerrilla. What made him do that? So, well, I should say too, before I go to my next slide, it's not a requirement to grow a mustache to study Quantrill. You can research, you can research Quantrill, right. without having any facial hair at all, I'm sure. This is just a coincidence. Now, here's my shameless plug. So when I decided to research Quantrill, I really wanted to get into his humanity and look at who he was. And what has perplexed biographers of Quantrill for a long time is that he did shift and change so much. He was a teacher, he was a frontiersman, free soiler, pro-slavery. He was a teamster. He panned for gold out in the Rocky Mountains. He did any number of things. And previous biographers have had a hard time taking him seriously or taking these changes that he went through sincerely. And what I decided to do was to try and take him sincerely at every turn. Now, not sympathetically per se, but I wanted to know why he decided to go from X to Y to Z. And I also wanted to look at his decisions, his motivations, within the context of what he knew at the time. William E. Connolly and these other biographers, there's a lot of hindsight that goes on in their work. Everything is going to culminate in the Civil War, almost as if Quantrill and everyone knew it was going to happen. But they didn't know. They didn't know. So I wanted to follow him step by step and start at the beginning and figure out who this guy was, what he was chasing, and ultimately learn how he ended up where he ended up. You can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it at your local bookstore. There's the cover. If you want to take a picture, get out your phone. I just told Tom I didn't bring any with me, so hopefully you guys remember to buy that thing. But let's go back to the beginning. So one of the, I think, great myths about Quantrill was that he was this sort of monster as a child, that he was a fiendish little boy and all of these other things. But when I went back and actually did the research, I found that the opposite was the case. William Clarke Quantrill, who's born in July 1837 up in Canal Dover, Ohio, was actually an incredibly sensitive young man, a sweet little boy. 20 years after the war, when the townspeople were remembering him, they talked about him in glowing terms. Now, these are people who all went and fought for the Union, and they knew what he did at Lawrence, and yet they still remembered him as civil and quiet. His mother talked of him of being of a retiring nature. And then she went one step further, and she referred to his character as more of that of a girl's than a boy's. Which, by the way, we can get into that in the question and answer. That obviously made me think about some things. And now, it's one thing for a mom to say that her son was not a terrible murderer, that he was reserved, that he was quiet, but to go as far as to say he was more girlish than anything, something about that rang true. And so the picture we have of Quantrill as a young man is actually of, like I said, this sensitive young man. He's an incredibly good student. He's well-read. His father is the schoolmaster in the town. And he goes on to not only excel at school, but become the local teacher at Canal Dover. So he teaches in Ohio, and then later on he'll teach in Illinois, and then Indiana, and then he'll come back to Ohio. And by all accounts, William Clarke Quantrill was an excellent teacher, which I point out to my students, that even the best teachers can snap. We can all go bad. And after a few really bad essays on World War I, it's almost happened. Now, Quantrill will go out west to Kansas with 3 other men in 1857. Now, when they go out there, this is bleeding Kansas. Kansas had become a territory that was open for settlement in 1854 through the Kansas-Nebraska Act. I'm sure many of you recall this. The fate of Kansas in terms of slavery was going to be determined by the people on the ground. This is popular sovereignty. And as has happened many times in American history, after the first few elections turned out to be not exactly above board, the people on the ground lost faith in their electoral system, and they started, fighting and shooting and stabbing, and eventually we had open warfare in Kansas, starting in early 1855. So when Quantrill goes out there, you have to have a political view. You can't go out there and say, I'm just sitting on the fence. So you've got to pick one side or the other. And what's pretty clear is that he had free soil politics when he went out there. We get this from his letters that he sent home to his mother and his friends. There was also another young man from Canal Dover who was out there that left a diary, and he talked about going to these free soil political rallies. This is what like the teenagers would do on the weekends. But what's interesting about his free soil politics, and this is where other biographers I think have sort of gotten him wrong, is that free soil politics wasn't all the same. These people weren't all abolitionists. These people weren't all, of one stripe or another. It was a spectrum. And Quantrill fell into the more conservative end of the free soil spectrum. He identified with a guy named Jim Lane, which is ironic because he'll later try and kill him at Lawrence a few years later, but he saw Jim Lane as a hero. Jim Lane's from Indiana. He had been a Democrat for most of his life, and then he decided to go out and form a quote-unquote conservative free soil party in Kansas, meaning they wanted to exclude slaveholders from Kansas, but they also wanted to exclude all people of African descent from Kansas, free or slave. Jim Lane saw this country as a white man's country. That's very much what the old Northwest had been about when they excluded people of color in 1787. And now he's bringing that view out to Kansas. So if we fast forward and we see where Quantrill is going to jump over to the pro-slavery side, in terms of at least his racial politics, it wasn't a huge leap. He was already pretty conservative when it came to that. Now, Quantrill tries his hand at farming out in Kansas. He actually owns land in Kansas. I found a land deed where he's transferring his land to another person out in Kansas. Because ultimately, after trying his hand at farming, he realized what many young men have realized: it's tough. It's not fun. And he wanted to go find some adventure. So he joined a supply train headed out across the plains and across the Rocky Mountains to the Great Salt Lake, where they were going to resupply the United States Army under Albert Sidney Johnston out there, who was keeping an eye on the Mormons. They were trying to bring the Church of Latter-day Saints back into the fold. So Quantrill signed up as a teamster. He thought it'd be exciting. He'd get out west, see the sights. So from the summer of, or somewhere in the late spring, early summer of 1858, he basically walks across the plains, pulling a team of oxen or mules across the plains. They cross South Pass on September 1st, 1858. They said it snowed that day, September 1st, and then they made their way down into the Great Salt Lake Valley. There, he got to see the sights. He wrote about the Mormons. He joked with his mother about coming home with like 12 wives or 20 wives or whatever. They all thought was funny. These were all young men, and they thought that the Mormons were this sort of oddity. And then he tried to make his way out there, and he worked as a cook and worked for the quartermaster for a bit, and he became deathly ill. And this is a very traumatic experience for him. Like it seems like he didn't think he was going to make it, but he gets better. And in February of 1859, remember that date, February 1859, him and around 20 other young men decide that they're going to go check out the gold rush at Pikes Peak. Now, they're on that side of the mountains. Pikes Peak's over here, so they're going to cross the Rocky Mountains in February. Now, we just saw what happened out in the Sierra Nevadas, right? Like, you're out in the mountains in February, it can get a little dicey. To make matters worse, I'm pretty sure they did not go back the way they came. I think they tried to go south and then work their way back up. Whatever happened, they got lost. And they got caught in a blizzard, and half of Quantrill's party died in the mountains, either through exposure or just got wandered off, got lost. They may have been attacked by Native Americans at some point. His letters are sort of vague, and there's going to be another Native American attack, so it's hard to know which one he was talking about. But half of his party dies. He finally makes it to Pikes Peak, and with a couple of the survivors, they try their hand at excavating for gold. He has a very exact number. I think it's $56.43 that he makes over 6 weeks, which he says barely covers his expenses. And he tells his mom it's the humbug of all humbugs. And so he pulls up stakes again. This is sort of a theme in his life. I don't want to do this. And him and a partner now make their way back across the plains towards the eastern settlements in Kansas. They get about halfway there. They're camping. Quantrill goes out to go kill dinner. And while he's gone, their camp gets raided by Native Americans. He hears the shots. He comes running back. He said it's about a mile away. He comes running back. And he gets there just in time to see the Native Americans riding off with all their horses, all their possessions, and he finds his buddy all shot to pieces laying there on the ground. Shot 17 times, arrows, buckshot, bullets, all that. His friend lives immediately after that. We don't know how much longer than that. I don't have any records to show one way or the other, but you can imagine how traumatic that would be. And then a few weeks after that, he wanders back into Lawrence, Kansas. And when he walks into Kansas at the end of July, 1859, he writes a letter to his mom. It's one of the first things that he does. And in the letter, he says, basically, I just got here. He tells her everything that happened. And these people have basically turned their backs on me. And you can imagine him walking out of the wilderness, covered in mud, dust. I mean, it's Kansas in summertime, so probably a lot of dust, dried blood. He has no possessions. He probably just has his hunting rifle. That's about it. And then these people, the first white people he has seen in a while, don't welcome him with open arms. They don't find shelter for him. Instead, he feels like, he perceives that they have turned their backs on him. Now, I don't have a smoking gun for when his politics changed, but I know he was a free soiler when he went out there. And after this moment, when he gets back to Lawrence, now he's going to be more and more pro-slavery. And I think what happened is he experienced a series of traumatic events that impacted him. He's a young man at this time, 21 years old, 22 years old. And then he projected his bitterness, his pain onto these folks in Lawrence. He also, along the way, had met a number of frontiersmen who were Southerners, and I'm sure they influenced his life. His father had died when he was fairly young, when he was 18 in 1854. So he had a lot of older men with pro-slavery politics that almost certainly mentored him and shaped his politics a little bit. But I think this is the moment, where really things start to shift. So that starts to get to our question about how does his politics change? Something else happens in the mountains that starts to show us, or starts to hint at how he's going to fight during the war. Now, sorry, I have my notes in my phone. I'm not texting anyone. I'm not live tweeting this. I'm just going to read this to you. I told you he shifts. He changes shape over the course of his life. He takes on a number of different masculine forms. But one that he feels most comfortable in is that of the hunter, of American myth and reality. He had hunted from the time he was a little boy. He wrote about it in his letters. But now when he's out west in the mountains, he really gets to become one of these guys, like one of Frederick Remington's guys. He writes a letter to his sister not long after he gets back to the settlements, and he describes what he looked like out in the mountains. And I'm going to read it to you. So he tells her that he wore, quote, a complete suit of buckskin, pants, coat, moccasins, and a red woolen shirt. And this would have been a woolen hunting shirt, right, with the big pockets on the chest. A fur cap, a large leather belt in which I had a large pistol and knife, a dragoon pistol, a revolver, and then mounted on an Indian pony, with my rifle laying across the saddle, ready for use in a moment's warning. We look rough enough, for we do not shave or cut our hair, and to a person not used to such sights, we look like ruffians. Doesn't he kind of sound like one of Frederick Remington's guys here? When I close my eyes, though, and I read that description, you know what I see? I see the first rough outlines of a bushwhacker. The bushwhackers, they wore their flamboyant guerrilla shirts, right, which were essentially antebellum hunting shirts, sort of with more stitching and even more color. They grew their hair long, their beards long. They're mounted, almost exclusively on horses. They carried revolvers, which was, pretty unique for the time. So what he's doing here is he's inhabiting a type of manhood that he couldn't have known he would end up needing down the road. But this is going to be something that's going to help him to form connections with the young men in Missouri who are the literal descendants of Daniel Boone and his people. And so they too, connected with this idea of the frontiersman, the hunter of American myth and reality. And of course, he developed all these skills: marksmanship, horsemanship. He could live out there in the wilderness. And he had experienced Indian warfare, granted on the wrong end of things, which is going to influence the way that he's going to fight later on. Let's see here. So he gets back to Kansas in 1859. In the fall of 1859, he goes back to being a teacher again, a great teacher by all accounts. He teaches fall of 1859 into the spring of 1860, and then he does something very, very strange, something that few people in the 19th century did. He started operating under an alias. He started using a different name, Charlie Hart, which isn't that a great name? Doesn't he sound like a poker player or just a great old school country singer or something? Charlie Hart. Now, Charlie Hart turns up in Lawrence early summer 1860. And we know this is Quantrill. We've been able to put these pieces together, but it has perplexed biographers up to this point what exactly he was doing, because he's not conning people out of his money or out of their money. He's involved in, he's somehow connected to horse thieving, but we're unsure exactly how. And so this was a really difficult problem to solve when I was doing the research, but I was able to sort of figure it all out. And I figured it out the same way detectives figure out cold cases, which, I'm sure there are some law enforcement folks here and some attorneys, but the person that did the crime, they're in the record already, right? They were asked questions early on in the investigation and then they passed by them. They're in the record. So I went into William E. Connolly's stuff and went digging deeper and deeper into the stuff that he had, but he didn't use. And sure enough, there was testimony there that said William Clarke Quantrill had been an undercover livestock detective. And then you start to see other things. He told other people he was a detective. And other people had referred to him as a detective. And you're able to sort of put the pieces together. And then I finally was able to place him in this, you can imagine, it's a frontier hotel in Paola, Kansas. And the pro-slavery clique of Eastern Kansas is meeting upstairs. So it's, imagine cigar smoke and whiskey and glasses clinking and hushed tones. And they put together this plan. Now, who's a part of this clique? It's the lieutenant governor. He has pro-slavery politics. The most powerful Indian agent has pro-slavery politics. And they are putting together a plan to catch the Jayhawkers. They can't catch them liberating slaves because there's quite a few people in Kansas who don't have any problem with them liberating slaves. You'd have to get the right jury, right prosecutor, right judge, and then hope that it doesn't get overturned. But everybody hates a horse thief. It doesn't matter which side of the political aisle you're on. And the Jayhawkers loved to steal horses. They stole slaveholders' horses. They stole non-slaveholders' horses. But they mostly stole horses from the Delaware, the Shawnee, all the different Native American tribes that lived around Lawrence. And the Delaware and Shawnee were in negotiations with the federal government to give up some of their land to have the railroad, cross Kansas. And as a part of their negotiations, they said, hey, these white people keep stealing all of our horses. We need, some sort of reparation here. And that gives you, a sense of just how important this was to them. So they install Quantrill, AKA Charlie Hart. He infiltrates a couple different bands of Jayhawkers, and he's basically there to catch them stealing horses. So this is like the Al Capone situation, right? Nobody cares that he's bringing whiskey into the country, but nobody likes a rich guy that cheats on his taxes. Same thing here. Nobody likes a horse thief. And we do have some evidence that he may have been a secret witness for the lieutenant governor, for the Indian agent who are trying to capture these guys. And we also know that several Jayhawkers around this period were indicted and were tried. Now, to go back to my Al Capone metaphor, you guys know that moment in the mob movie where the undercover agent realizes he's in too deep and he's either gonna have to do something really terrible to stay undercover or he's gonna have to blow his cover? That's gonna happen to Quantrill in December of 1860. In December of 1860, he's still operating as Charlie Hart. He's riding with 3 Jayhawkers over to Missouri, to the Morgan Walker farm. Morgan Walker had 20-something slaves. He's a planter, but he also had close to 30 of the finest thoroughbred horses in western Missouri. Quantrill doesn't know the plan, he doesn't know the target, but as they get closer to the Walker farm, they finally tell him, he's new to the band, we're gonna go to this Walker guy's farm, we're gonna liberate his slaves, we're gonna steal his horses, and then we're gonna kill him and his whole family. in too deep, right? So now Quantrill has to make a choice. I keep my cover as Charlie Hart. Maybe we can, get these guys arrested back in Kansas, or I do something that's going to prevent these people's murder. And so that's what he does. He begs off. He says, I'm going to do some reconnaissance. He rides up to the walkers, doesn't do any reconnaissance, just rides right up to him and says, hey, so there's some guys out in the woods back there, and this is what they're going to do. And so the walkers set a trap. Quantrill brings these Jayhawkers back. They ambush the Jayhawkers. There's a firefight that night and then one a couple days later, and they end up killing all three of them. And Quantrill comes clean. He tells these guys who he is, for the most part. He says he's from Maryland, not Ohio. He wants to get in good with these people. And the Walker family more or less adopts him. This is how he joins the Missouri side. And think about what's going on in December of 1860. South Carolina has just seceded from the Union. The other deep states in the Deep South are having their secession conventions. So the whole country's breaking apart at this moment. Everybody's taking sides. And he ends up with these people. Now, he's there for a few weeks, probably into early 1861, when one of the Walker's friends, a guy named Marcus Gill, says, hey, I need a hand. I need somebody to help move my slaves from Missouri down to Texas, because his slaves had been running away. He'd lost over 10 slaves in the previous year running away to Kansas. So either Quantrill volunteered or they volunteered Quantrill, and Quantrill helps drive this man's slaves down to Texas, which is where he's going to end up, or where he's going to be when the war probably breaks out. He's probably in Texas for when they secede, and then the war breaks out, either when he's there or making his way back. Now, before we get into the war, I want to point something out, another just fun primary source that you come across when you study a guy like Quantrill. There is no William Clarke Quantrill in the 1860 census. So if we as historians are bound by primary sources, he doesn't exist in 1860. You know who exists? Charlie Hart. He's in the census as Charlie Hart in 1860, which is fairly anomalous. There's probably not too many people that did that, but historians tend to take the census as, the Holy Testament, right? It is the truth. But when you see something like that, you start to wonder, who else is lying on the census about stuff other than how much money they make and all of that? But there's Charlie Hart. So Quantrill disappears there for the 1860 census. Now, like I said, war breaks out. He's making his way back north, and he joins the Confederate Army. He joins the Confederate Army when he is living in the Indian Territories in Oklahoma. He's staying with a Native American. He's the son of a chief, a guy named Joel Mays, and he will end up joining the Confederate Army, and he fights at the Battle of Wilson's Creek. He comes out of the battle unscathed, but he gets sick after the battle. And if you know anything about that battle, the Confederates win that battle in southwestern Missouri, but they don't follow up on their victory. The Confederate Army sort of splits up, and part of it goes north and part of it goes back into Arkansas. Quantrill gets sick. So the army marches away. He's sick, probably with dysentery, spends a couple weeks in a bed or a cot or lying in the woods. And then he gets better, and he doesn't know where to go. So he goes back to the Morgan Walker farm, right? This is the last place he'd been in Missouri. He made a connection with these people, so he goes back. And now the people of Jackson County, Missouri, and all of Little Dixie, which are all those counties on either side of the Missouri River, where most of the major slaveholders live, they are now left to their own defense. The Confederate Army has abandoned them. And so young men in these neighborhoods start patrolling and defending their own neighborhoods. And that's what happens here in the Blue Springs neighborhood of Jackson County. Quantrill joins this neighborhood patrol, which of course had its roots in the militia and all these old traditions, the slave patrol. And it's going to be him and 11 other guys. And he's a follower here. He's not a leader. The son of Morgan Walker, this wealthy slaveholder, he's going to be the leader, Andy Walker. And Quantrill's just a hired hand. And now hired hands are becoming hired guns, right? And at some point, they're patrolling the neighborhood and they hear about a Union detachment raiding some of the local plantations, and they ride off to meet them. And this is going to be their first battle. They get in a firefight. It's messy. You can imagine they probably expended a couple hundred rounds, and only one guy is hit, a Union soldier, and he ends up dying. And Quantrill is the one who kills him. So he's a killer among novices. He's the first one to kill the enemy. And from that point on, he sort of starts to go up and up and up and up in the band. And by early 1862, he is the leader of this first guerrilla band in western Missouri. So that's how he becomes the leader, going from an outsider to becoming the man. I should also note this picture, which is also on the cover of my book, this is the only good image we have of Quantrill. You look at other biographies of Quantrill, some of them have this picture, but with like a mustache graffitied on his face, like he's some vaudeville villain, you know, who's gonna like tie a damsel to railroad tracks. In other ones, they're just black and white pictures of just some random guy from the 19th century, which I'm sure we've all noticed this trend that like every picture on the internet is Jesse James, every single one of them, right? Or Billy the Kid or whoever. But this is the only one that we can actually confirm was him. And this was I think it was a tintype that got faded. It had been like, found in someone's yard, and then an etching done from the tintype. So that's as close as we can get to knowing what Quantrill actually looked like. In 1862, we see Quantrill put his stamp on the guerrilla war in Missouri. He influenced the tactics greatly. It's fairly traditional guerrilla tactics: ambush, running fights, hit soft targets. They will eventually start attacking civilians more and more as the war goes on. It doesn't really start that way, but it ends up that way. One of the more fascinating tactics they employ is they wear blue Union uniforms. This throws the Union Army for a loop. I mean, and you don't really see this anywhere else in the war this early on. Now, it'll start to get picked up elsewhere, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they're the only people doing this. And if you read the reports, it's fascinating, because the Union, they can't figure out who's who. They start shooting at each other in the woods, but the guerrillas don't have any problem recognizing who's who, because of course, they all know each other, right? They can recognize each other by face, by what horse they're riding, all of those things, by their voice. This is a picture of George Todd, one of Quantrill's lieutenants, and it's the only one we have of a guerrilla wearing a blue Union uniform. But isn't that great? And you can tell he wants to let you in on the joke, right? You see that little smile? Like a Mona Lisa smile a little bit. So this disguise, or this tactic of using disguises, do you know what it makes me think of? Charlie Hart, right? Quantrill had operated as a confidence man. He had operated undercover. He saw how northern bourgeois Americans reacted to the way that you dress, the way that you act, the way that you speak, that they would use all of these clues to basically project an identity onto you. And now he's going to use that against them. Now, along the way, he gets connected into this network of rebel households. Now, he doesn't have any kin in this area, but all of his men do. And so they're going to rely on Southern households in Western Missouri to provide them with support. And the Southern household's very much an engine of the guerrilla war. And who's doing the work? The women. Their mothers, their sisters, cousins, sweethearts, occasionally a wife. Most of them are too young to have wives. But they're the ones that are generating all the support for the war. Food, clothing, they're hiding ammunition, they're providing information, they're taking care of the horses. Everything is coming from the women. And then all of these households are connected either through blood or marriage, which again, if you're a guerrilla, you know how all these houses are connected. If you are a Yankee officer from Ohio or Wisconsin, or God forbid, Massachusetts, and you get stuck in Missouri and you try and untangle, who's married to who and how, you could see how they'd be lost, how they'd have a hard time untangling this thing. So by the end of 1862, the Confederate guerrillas in Western Missouri are riding the Union Army out of their saddles. They don't have an answer one way or the other. Now, between 62 and 63, Quantrill actually travels to Richmond, Virginia. This had been thought to be a myth or a story that he told, that he just sort of took a break from the war. I was able to find an article in the Richmond Sentinel in March of 1863 saying he was there in Richmond, Colonel Quantrill. So we know he went there. He may have even gotten a partisan commission as a colonel, and then he comes back in 63. And we know what happens in 63, right? I already told you. They're riding the Union Army out of their saddles. It's unstable. Now the Union Army starts shifting things around. They change the makeup of the border. They add a new district of the border that'll get more resources. And the war's changing overall, right? In 63, some important things are happening. We have the Emancipation Proclamation, right? Black soldiers are being recruited across the North and the South. These guerrillas read the newspaper. Quantrill read the newspaper. They were reading about what the 54th of Massachusetts did at Fort Wagner outside of Charleston. They were reading about the black troops being recruited. And to make matters worse for them, their district commander, a guy named Thomas Ewing, had just told his own soldiers that they were now going to start liberating all of the slaves off all the farms, and they were going to arm the men and enroll them in the Union Army. And this is a nightmare for them. To make matters worse, they're now arresting their women. General Ewing is trying to uproot their supply network. So even though they're winning the war in Western Missouri, they decide they have to do something else, something bigger, something symbolic. And what's more symbolic than attacking the symbol of abolitionism, Lawrence? So that's how they came up with that plan. And it was Quantrill's plan. So they come up with the plan August 10th. To make matters worse, on August 13th, a prison holding their women collapses in Kansas City, and 4 of the women are killed outright. I think another one dies later than that. Bloody Bill Anderson's sisters, famously among them. That happens on the 13th, so that makes Lawrence probably bloodier than it would have been. They ride across the Kansas plains. They ride past 2 Union outposts, and the Union cavalry just waves to them because they're wearing blue Union uniforms. They get to Mount Oread in the early morning hours of the 21st, and Quantrill turns to his men, and he says, remember, this is the great hotbed of abolitionism, and you will kill, 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 and make no mistake, kill every man and boy big enough to carry a gun. And then that's what they did. He let them loose, and they did all of that. Now, Quantrill, interestingly enough, didn't kill anyone during the raid. In fact, he saved a number of people's lives probably because he knew them. We also think he saved people at a hotel because he knew that they were there. They were tourists. They essentially were not from Lawrence. And then after the raid on Lawrence, of course, we get General Order 11, which depopulates all of Western Missouri. That's what General Thomas Ewing did in response to this. And it effectively ended the guerrilla war in Western Missouri. They'll end up moving to Central Missouri, and the war will get bloodier there. Quantrill, for his part, is going to win one more big battle at Baxter Springs in southeastern Kansas, and then they're going to go to Texas for the winter. And it's in Texas that his power is first usurped by Bloody Bill Anderson, and then later on in Missouri in that spring by George Todd, that guy wearing that blue Union uniform. And then Quantrill goes into retirement from 64 to really early 65. Now, if I were talking to a bunch of Missourians or Kansans on the border, I'd probably end my talk here. But since we're in Kentucky, let's talk about Kentucky. Because in January of 1865, a mysterious figure shows up in the Bluegrass State. Captain Clarke of the 4th Missouri Cavalry. He's leading around 35 Federal soldiers, all wearing blue Union uniforms. And what's great about this, I think you guys might know who I'm talking about here, who this Captain Clarke really is. What's beautiful about this is if you go back to the OR, you can find a bunch of reports about this Captain Clarke character in January, February. And of course, they're going to spend the rest of the spring looking for this Quantrill character, right? And they never put together that one and the other are the same. So here's a brief report from, I'll read it for those of you who are too far from the projector, but this is from January 29th, 1865, sent from Danville. 35 guerrillas under Captain Clarke, all dressed in federal uniform, entered Danville this morning. They robbed some of the citizens and one boot store. These guys had style, right? One boot store, and left on the Perryville Pike at 11:15 a.m. They claimed at first to be federal troops, 4th Missouri Cavalry, but there is no doubt they are guerrillas in disguise. They gutted my office here pretty effectively. W.L. Gross, Captain and Assistant Superintendent, Military Telegraph, so on and so forth. So now Quantrill's in Kentucky. Something fascinating happens. Now there's rumors that Quantrill had come over this way, that he crossed the Mississippi. Nobody knew where he was. There's rumor that he was back down in Texas. There's rumors that he was all over the place. But in February of 1865, the Union Army decides to do something. Now it could just be a coincidence, but I think it has something to do with this, and it has something to do with Sue Mundy and all those other guys. In February of 1865, they turned Kentucky from a district back into a department. In other words, they realized Kentucky was going to need a lot more soldiers. So in February of 1865, it's a department, and now it's on. And this is really when they put the clamp down on the guerrillas. Look at that beautiful young man. You could see how he would get confused for a young woman. So the Missourians had allies in Kentucky. Most of the folks who had ended up in western Missouri were related to the folks who had been in Virginia and then came across into Kentucky and then so on and so forth. Like I said before, most of these people were in some way, shape, or form related to Daniel Boone and the various members of the Scholl family and all those other families that were connected to him. And so they had second and third cousins that were back here. And so they didn't know them by sight, but they knew them by name. And so when they came back, they connected into these kinship networks here. In addition to that, of course, oh, and I should say too, it's women in Kentucky who are also supporting the guerrilla war here. They're providing them with everything that they need. But they also make friends with Sue Mundy and her gang, right? Jerome Clark. By the way, the name Clark pops up a lot. It's almost creepy, right? Because you've got William Clarke Quantrill, who becomes, of course, Captain Clark. You've got Jerome Clark. You've got later on Kate Clark, who was Quantrill's child bride. Anyway, and they agree to work together. And so they meet, and I think it's the McClaskey farm at one point. That's where they first meet. There was a Dr. McClaskey, who was a Southern sympathizer. And they basically come up with some sort of plan. We don't know what it is, but basically they go on raising hell. Now, of course, we know that Magruder and Clark and their gang is going to get broken up earlier than Quantrill and his guys, I believe in March of 65. Am I right on that? March of 65? It's good to have another expert in the room here. Got about 100 probably. But they get broken up, but Quantrill and his guys continue to fight. And it's not until May 10th, 1865, that they get caught. Bad Ed Terrell. Or Terrell. Terrell. Bad Ed Terrell. Child killer. He had been hired private contractor by the Union Army to hunt down Confederate guerrillas. He had a sordid past that we don't know too much about. He may have been a Confederate to start the war, may have killed his commanding officer. What the Union Army knew is that he was good at killing. So he led around 20 men, and they were on the hunt for this guy named William Clarke Quantrill. They ended up riding up, just by accident, riding up this road here next to the Wakefield farm in the rain. Nobody on the road except for the blacksmith, who was a free African-American man. Now, the blacksmith came out and told Bad Ed Terrell, he said, hey, you might want to know something. 20-something riders that I didn't recognize just rode down this lane to the Wakefield farm. So Terrell and his guys, they, get their tack together. They, cinch up their horses, and they start trotting down the lane. Captain Clark, 4th Missouri, and his men, they'd been up for 3 or 4 days. So it's raining now. They get to the Wakefield farm, and they decide they need to take a nap. Quantrill makes the mistake of not putting out pickets. They go up into the hayloft. Most of the men fall asleep. There's a couple outside, and it's 1 or 2 of the men outside that see this group of 20-something riders coming down the lane, and they yell, "Here they come." And can you imagine what those guys looked like falling out of that barn, this way and that way, second story, running to their horses? Most of the Missourians get to their horses and ride off to the tree line. Quantrill's horse, his war horse that he'd had for 4 years, had been maimed a few weeks earlier, and he was on a new horse, an unbroken horse. And he kept trying to get on this horse, and it kept wheeling away from him and riding away from him. And so he became an easy target. They thought he was just a rookie, right? An amateur. So Quantrill finally says, "See ya" to the horse, and tries to make it on foot. 2 of his men tried to wait for him and pick him up. Both of those guys would end up killed. No good deed goes unpunished. And Quantrill's running. He gets shot by a rider, probably at close distance, probably coming up here. And the bullet hits him in his shoulder blade. It goes down through his spine and ends up down near his hip, and he's paralyzed. May 10th, 1865. Now, Bad Ed Terrell questions him. He says, "Do you ride with Quantrill? Do you know who Quantrill is?" And he says, "No, I'm Captain Clark, 4th Missouri. I don't know who that guy is." And here's the remarkable thing, the thing that we often forget when we study the past. They had no idea what Quantrill looked like. So they had to take him at his word. So they told Wakefield, basically, Quantrill says to them, can I just stay here and die? And they say, yeah, you can stay here and die. But they say to Wakefield, if he leaves, if he escapes, we're going to burn down your whole farm. So they go off, they ride around in the woods for 2 more days. They finally circle back. And then Quantrill, at this point, I think is hoping he's just going to be executed, because he's Quantrill. And he just says, boys, you got me. I'm Quantrill. They put him in a wagon. They ride him up to Louisville. It takes a couple days. And then he's going to spend the rest of his days, in a hospital there in Louisville, paralyzed, probably suffering terribly. Some Sisters of Mercy looked after him. And on June 6, 1865, he died. He paid a priest. He converted to Catholicism. He paid Father Powers $800 to hide his body. So they put it in the cemetery, left no mound over it, and then they told the sexton to throw their kitchen scraps over the top of it. So even in death, Quantrill continues to evade us. I won't even go on about what has happened to his bones since then, but that's my talk. I look forward to any and all questions that you have about William Clarke Quantrill. Yes, sir.
Were the James brothers ever connected with Quantrill?
Yes.
What role did they play? And the youngers?
Yeah, so Frank James was like Quantrill in that he was older. So Frank James joined the Confederate Army, or the Missouri State Guard, they called it, and fought in a couple battles, and then he ends up back in Clay County, which is just north of the river in Kansas City, right? Jackson is south, Clay is north. And so he fought with his own little band for a while there under this guy named either Ferdinand or Fernando Scott. I prefer to think his name was Fernando Scott. And so they fought kind of up in Clay County by themselves, but then ultimately they got absorbed by Quantrill and his guys. Jesse doesn't join up until we think the end of 64. So he was so young, he doesn't start fighting until 64, and he's going to join his brother fighting under Bloody Bill Anderson. So this is after Quantrill's power has really been usurped. So he fights under him. And then they rode with Quantrill and his guys close to Kentucky, but there was sort of a split. Quantrill comes over with guys to Kentucky, and then the rest of them ride down to Texas, and we believe Jesse and Frank went to Texas at that point. But to give you a sense of how close the kinship networks were, right? The James brothers were back over in Kentucky after the war. They had cousins over here who they were close with, who put them up when they were robbing banks and all that. Way in the back.
Was it Sarah also called a red leg?
Who would be a red leg?
Sarah.
No, so the red legs, it's funny because we get this from the outlaw Josie Wales. I feel like they could conflate some people here. But the red legs were one particular band of jayhawkers who were out in Kansas. So Bad Ed would have had no connection with them other than he hunted bushwhackers. Yes, sir?
Whatever happened to Bloody Bill?
Ooh, Bloody Bill. So at the end of October 1864, so Sterling Price, who's this general from Missouri, tries to retake Missouri. It's never going to happen. But he tries to retake Missouri in the fall of 64. And the guerrillas are sort of working in concert, and they're raising hell all over central Missouri. And so Anderson does that through the fall, and then as Price and his guys leave the state, because they know that they're not going to be able to hold on to Missouri, Anderson continues to go on and fight and raid towns. And eventually he gets ambushed much the same way he had ambushed other folks. That basically he gets suckered into attacking a line of a significant number of Union troops. He gets shot a couple times, one in the head, maybe even twice in the head. So he gets killed in, I think it's October 27th, maybe 64. And then they drag him into the town of Richmond. They take a picture of him. It's a fascinating photograph, a little gory, but a photograph of him. It's great because it shows his guerrilla shirt. That's why I like it. And then the story is they drag his body back and forth through town. They decapitate him, put his head on a telegraph post, very like medieval England here, and they bury his body in an unmarked grave. So that's what happened to Bill. Yes, sir?
What stops did Quantrill make between Danville and Wakefield?
I don't know. Tom, what stops did he make?
Who made?
Between Danville and where else? And Wakefield. What are some of the other spots that the guerrillas hit?
Taylorsville.
Taylorsville.
Shelbyville, Danville.
This is great. I'm not giving you any of my money, but this is great.
Well, they stopped in Washington County and Springfield, Nelson County, Bardstown.
Yeah, they were sort of all over the place. But to answer your question more directly, I don't have a great timeline for their time here in Kentucky. You know, I know some of the spots, but I was just saying to Tom, what I would like to do is actually do a much more in-depth look, and I think he wants to do something similar, try and figure out where they were, all the places they hit. I'd be really interested in knowing everyone who tried to help them or did help them, you know, where these connections came from. Because there's not a significant guerrilla war in Kentucky until really after that second battle of Cynthiana. Is that how you pronounce it, Cynthiana? And then the Union Army blocks all the mountain gaps, so they can't get back over after they get broken up. That's how like Sue Money and those guys end up stuck here in Kentucky. And then they tap into their old kinship networks. At least that's my hypothesis. And then that's where they really sort of take off from there. And of course, since the Army hadn't had to fight guerrillas a bunch here, they were able to do it for months before really the Army was able to, you know, clamp down on them. Yes, sir. The creative writer. Great to see.
Thanks so much for your talk. This is wonderful. I was just curious, in the kind of Charlie Hart undercover period.
Yeah.
I was wondering, I feel like I've read stuff about like some of that was also like a period where he was, and I'd love you if you can correct me, but like he was going on these raids with Jayhawkers, right?
Right.
And you know, to free enslaved people. But then what I've read is he would like turn around and like bring them back to Missouri.
Right.
For the war or whatever.
Yeah.
Is that the?
So that story it's out there. I mean, I've seen that at different places. I was not able to find anything to corroborate that.
Okay.
Now, but that was a thing. Jayhawkers did that, you know, that they'd sort of either resell the slaves or they would like kind of like let the slave catcher know on the side, like, hey, we just liberated them, but they're in whatever town, whatever settlement, and they'd give them $50 and they'd ride off and go get them. So could Quantrill have been involved in that sort of thing? Absolutely. But I was not able to find anything that actually like, you know, so I could actually pinpoint that. I wish I did. That'd be a great part of the story, but
Okay.
yeah. Yep. Yes, sir.
Was it Union policy to execute these guys if they caught them? They weren't treated as prisoners of war, right?
Yeah, so in the first order that General Henry Halleck, Old Brains, that became his nickname, Old Brains, who was an intellectual before the war and an Army officer. So when he's leading the Department of the Missouri, he has an order in December of 61 and then another one in March of 62. One is to target saboteurs specifically, but in March 62, it specifically passes this order. It basically says, it doesn't matter what you do. If you are a guerrilla, you forfeit your life. And what he's trying to do, I think, is to encourage them to get out of the state and go join the Confederate Army and fight out in the open so we can kill you out in the open, because these guys, they can't catch them. Now, what ends up happening is what has happened, and we've seen this in our counterinsurgency policies in the 20th and 21st century, is that when you do that, you actually end up creating more guerrillas, right? Because it gives basically license to Union officers, this is what ends up happening at least, to target men with Southern politics who are dressed in civilian clothes. Because that's, of course, what a guerrilla is, right? And so they end up killing a number of innocent people, and so then those people's sons, fathers, brothers, they go into the bush, and what Halleck realizes too late is that he's actually created a guerrilla problem rather than solving a guerrilla problem. But he takes it to Washington with him and makes it a part of the Lieber Code, General Order 100, so that becomes the national policy. And so we still don't know the amount of guerrillas in the Confederacy, but it never really stopped. These people ultimately sort of got folded into the KKK and other post-war vigilante groups. So I think the counterinsurgency policies probably did more to create problems than really solve them. But yeah, they couldn't surrender until 65. And then in the spring of 65, a couple generals on the ground said, we're not going to be able to end the war unless we let them surrender, right? They're just going to keep fighting forever. So they started doing that piecemeal, and they realized that would end guerrilla conflicts if they did let the guys come in. in those areas. But in other places they did. Jesse James never surrendered, and we know what happened to Quantrill.
But it's especially egregious when they're wearing blue uniforms.
Oh yeah, yeah. I'm not saying they didn't deserve it. Well, because of course then they're a spy, right? And spies have always been executed. That's always been the policy. Yes, sir.
Was there any connection to the Confederate command and control?
There were, yes, there was some. So now the Confederates have an issue with command and control with their formal armies west of the Mississippi River. So in other words, the Confederate armies west of the Mississippi River are very much left to their own devices. They can't wait for orders from Richmond. They don't have the telegraph network that the Union does. But Quantrill and his men are commissioned. He's commissioned as officer, and his men are enrolled in August of 1862. But they're enrolled by probably, we think, Thomas Hindman, who was a Confederate officer west of the Mississippi, but somewhere on that sort of branch of the Confederate Army. And then, like I said, he goes to Richmond. We know that now. I don't know if he was just calling himself colonel or if he actually received a colonelcy. There's a great historian, Barton Myers, who's been working on guerrilla stuff too, partisan stuff too, and he couldn't find the record for me either. So we don't know if he got a colonelcy, but he was commissioned as a captain in the Confederate Army. Now, they had much tighter control over the guerrillas that actually operated in Northern Virginia and all that, Mosby and some of those guys. But the guerrillas in the West were left to their own devices. And of course, it would devolve into a very brutal conflict with scalping and killing civilians and all of that. You. Yep, sorry. Just call it you.
In the movie, Ride with the Devil.
Yeah.
Tobey Maguire.
Uh-huh.
It sounds like you wrote the script, but and that there was, if someone knew someone else that was on the other side, they went and murdered them.
Right.
It also showed Quantrill and the raid on Lawrence.
Mm-hmm.
Can you comment on how historically accurate that movie was, and if you recommend anyone who hasn't seen it to watch it? I thought it was really outstanding.
Yeah. I generally agree. Yeah, I think it's a really good movie. I think they did a really good job with the material culture too, like the wardrobe, right? What they're wearing.
And Quantrill was portrayed as a young man.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. No, so in general, I think it's good. I'm blown away by that movie. That was Ang Lee, the director Ang Lee. That was one of his first English language movies. So to pick that topic and then the research that him and his team must have done, because they do get a lot of it right. So in general, I like that. I mean, there's some issues with, it's hard to believe that like the German immigrant, right? Tobey Maguire's character is going to be best friends with this guy and that the war is going to survive that. And then of course, then his best friend's going to be black by the end of the war. You know what I mean? There's a lot of stuff that would have been hard to believe in Civil War Missouri. But I think they do that to help to help tell those stories. They have to bring these characters together somehow. So yeah, in general, I strongly recommend that, Ride with the Devil. It's a good one. Yes, sir.
I was in Louisville getting my first COVID test, COVID shot. My daughter at that time, she was in line over there. But it was on the west end of Louisville in a fairly new facility. And so walking around, and there's a big historical plaque right there. This is where Sue Mundy was hanged.
Yep. They said that I think over 10,000 people showed up to watch him hanged. People came over from Ohio. I mean, because it was so fascinating. Like, who was this person? Was this really a woman? Was it a man? Yeah. So yeah, one of the more remarkable things that probably happened in Louisville during the war, and a lot of stuff happened. Yes, sir.
I know Cincinnati, Ohio was referred to as the abolition city, especially in the 1840s or something.
Mm-hmm.
What made Kansas an abolition city?
The Kansas-Nebraska Act, and all of the decision to. So the way that Stephen Douglas, who's the senator from Illinois, who comes up with this idea, the way that he presents it is this is a compromise. That essentially slaveholders will move into Kansas, right? It's adjacent to Missouri, and people from the north will move into Nebraska. Well, it didn't take very long for those clever abolitionists in New England to realize, well, we can vote with our feet here, and we can go and settle in Kansas and just stop the westward expansion of slavery. And so that's how Kansas ends up becoming sort of this symbol, and Lawrence in particular, of abolition. But yeah, I mean, Cincinnati was well known for that. That's where Harriet Beecher Stowe heard about the slave crossing over and you know, started coming up with Uncle Tom's Cabin and all of that. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Was there much, if any, guerrilla activity out of the north?
In the north? Whew. Is there much activity in the north? I mean, the only thing that I can really think of are the raids, you know, by Morgan and.
I'm saying from the northern side, were there any guerrilla?
Oh, well, there were like Unionists in the South. Yeah, there's been a film recently, The Free State of Jones, that's based on a true story. Unionists in Mississippi. There were a lot of Unionists, of course, in the Appalachian areas of the South. And so, yeah, you had pro-Union guerrillas. That's the Hatfield-McCoy thing too, right? Where you had these communities that were divided, or on one side of a valley, there were Unionists. On the other side, there might have been some slaveholders. Shelton Laurel affair and all of that. So yeah, you did have some Unionist guerrillas fighting against the Confederacy from inside. Cold Mountain, right? I mean, Cold Mountain, that's, you know, kind of a thing. Other questions? Did we exhaust it? Have we heard enough about Quantrill? Yes, sir.
Is there a photograph of Ed Terrell? A known photograph?
Well, we think there is. We think there is. A friend of mine, Matt Holbert, wrote a piece on him, either for the Register or Ohio Valley History. And it's labeled as him, but even he's like not 100% sure. Yeah. I mean, he looks like a bad dude, right? I mean, it fits the description. But yeah, it's just so hard to know. I mean, I think a lot of people just say, this is Quantrill, this is Jesse James, this is Bad Ed, this is whoever. And people want to believe that, so they you know, take it in. But in terms of actually confirmed, I'm not 100% sure, but I think there might be one. Well, hey, thank all of you very much for inviting me here, letting me speak to you about my work. I really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun so far, and yeah, have me back sometime. I'll write another book. Yeah, thanks for having me, Ken. Appreciate it.